The heavy, violent sheets of rain hit the windshield, blurring the streetlights of the suburban cul-de-sac into smeared streaks of pale yellow. The wipers fought a losing battle on the highest setting. I killed the engine of my truck in the sweeping circular driveway of the sprawling waterfront house, the sudden quiet inside the cab immediately replaced by the aggressive drumming of the coastal squall against the safety glass. Lucy mumbled beside me, her breath fogging the passenger window as her head lolled against the cold pane. I sighed, the sound loud in the enclosed space, and unbuckled my seatbelt. I had spent the last 6 hours navigating a different, much more exhausting kind of storm, extracting my friend from a chaotic downtown party before she made a series of highly regrettable, permanent decisions. Now, it was midnight. My shift at the commercial marina started at 6 in the morning. My muscles were already aching from a full day of hauling anchor chains, and the barometric pressure was dropping fast enough to make my ears pop. I pushed my door open, stepping out into ankle-deep water rushing toward the storm drain. I walked around the heavy steel grille of the truck, fighting the wind that tried to rip the passenger door from my grip. I braced my hip against the frame, reached in, and hauled Lucy out, throwing her over my shoulder in a standard, efficient carry. She was wearing a light blue button-up shirt and gray pants, thoroughly soaked from our earlier sprint to the vehicle. I carried her up the long, slick brick walkway, the coastal wind biting fiercely at the back of my neck, and nudged the heavy mahogany front door open with the reinforced toe of my boot. The house was instantly quiet, insulated and perfectly still, smelling faintly of cedar wax, dry linen, and lemon polish. I bypassed the sweeping grand staircase and headed straight for the sunken living room, depositing Lucy gently onto a deep, floral-patterned couch. She immediately curled into a tight ball, her face pressed into the cushions, and started snoring with a soft, rhythmic whistle. "I appreciate you bringing her back in one piece, Connor," a quiet voice said from the shadowed archway. I turned, wiping a line of cold rainwater from my jaw. I found Valerie Mitchell in the archway, standing as still as a lighthouse. She was 39, but the sharp, assessing look in her dark eyes belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime managing crises and refusing to lose. She wore a plain gray pullover and dark slacks, looking entirely too composed for midnight on a Thursday. Her brown hair fell in soft, immaculate waves around her shoulders. I had met Lucy's mother exactly twice before, mostly in passing during dockside drop-offs. She always maintained a polite, impenetrable distance, building walls out of perfect, rigid manners. "She's fine," I said, keeping my voice low and flat to avoid waking Lucy. "She just needs water and 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep. I'll let myself out. Wait." Valerie stepped fully into the room, the hardwood floor making no sound under her shoes. The slight smile on her face was a masterclass in deflection. It didn't reach her eyes at all. It was a tight, deeply calculated expression. "Why don't you come inside and stay?" My hand stopped dead on the cold brass of the doorknob. The metal felt heavy and absolute. I make a living reading shifting pressure systems, anticipating catastrophic structural failure, and knowing exactly when a subtle change in the environment means imminent danger. I looked closely at Valerie. I saw the locked line of her shoulders, the shallow, uneven rhythm of her breathing, and the white-knuckle grip her fingers had on her own forearm. She wasn't inviting me to stay for a cup of tea, and she certainly wasn't looking for company. Her smile didn't reach her eyes and her hand never left her own forearm. "What's the actual problem, Valerie?" I asked, dropping my hand from the door and turning to face her fully. She let out a sharp, shaky breath. The polite smile vanished, leaving behind nothing but stark exhaustion. "Richard, my ex-husband. I just got a courier notice 2 hours ago. He's invoking a penalty clause in the divorce settlement regarding the Windward. The Windward was her 50-foot custom Hinckley sailboat, currently tied up at the private deepwater dock behind the house. It was a beautiful, deeply complex piece of machinery, easily worth $500,000. The clause states that if the vessel is not relocated to the neutral city marina by Monday at 0800 hours, he assumes full physical custody of the asset." Valerie explained, her voice remarkably steady despite the quiet, furious tension radiating from her. "He knows my regular captain is stuck in Florida with the commercial flight groundings. He tracked the weather system. He knows this gale is coming in off the Atlantic, and he fully expects me to default because I can't move a 50-foot boat alone in a storm." I looked past her, out the large floor-to-ceiling bay windows. The wind was already stripping dead branches from the massive oak trees, hurling them violently against the reinforced glass. Moving a heavy displacement keelboat through a tight coastal sound during a small craft advisory was not a favor. It was a massive, dangerous liability. But looking at Valerie, watching the way she refused to let her voice tremble despite the fact that her ex was actively trying to systematically strip away her independence, I felt a cold, hard line of focus snap into place in my mind. "You need a captain," I said. "I need someone who won't panic," she corrected, her chin lifting in a clear, desperate challenge. "I need you to move the boat tomorrow. I'll pay your emergency commercial rate. Double." I didn't answer immediately. Sympathy doesn't navigate shoals, and empty reassurances don't keep expensive fiberglass off the rocks. I walked over to the windows, tracking the aggressive sway of the trees and calculating the wind shear. The barometric pressure was tanking. "Show me the charts," I said. Valerie led me down a short hallway and into a dark, wood-paneled study. The room was lined with thick books, dominated by a large oak drafting table in the center under a brass pendant light. She unrolled a topographical nautical chart of the Northern Sound, pinning the corners down with heavy brass compass weights. I stepped up to the table, the familiar smell of aged paper and drafting graphite grounding me. I pulled a pair of parallel rulers and a mechanical pencil from the leather holder. "The transit is 40 nautical miles," I said, laying the clear rulers flat against the compass rose printed on the paper. I walked the rulers precisely across the chart to our destination, checking the true heading against the magnetic variation. Normally, that's a 6-hour motor sail under clear conditions. With the incoming front, we'll be fighting a 3-knot head current through the Narrows, and the wind will be pushing us heavily toward the eastern shoals. "Richard's lawyer sent the injunction via email," Valerie said, sliding a printed, legally stamped document onto the table under the light. "If the boat isn't secured in slip 44 at the city marina, with the harbor master's physical sign-off in the official log, by Monday morning, I lose my half of the equity. That's $400,000, Connor. It's the capital I need to keep this house." I didn't offer a pitying look. I picked up a yellow legal pad and began writing in block letters. "Departure at 0500 tomorrow. We need the outgoing tide to push us past the breakwater before the swell gets too large. Engine and systems checks at 0400. You'll be my deckhand. Can you handle a heavy-duty winch under serious load?" "I lived on that boat for 3 consecutive summers," she said, her voice dropping into a defensive, sharp tone. "I know the rigging better than most professionals." "Good." I tore the sheet of paper off the pad and slid it across the smooth wood toward her. "That's the timeline. Tasks, coordinates, and 3 contingency anchorages if the weather blows past 40 knots and we have to ditch. We stick to the schedule down to the minute. No debates on the water." Before Valerie could respond, a loud, sharp crack echoed from the backyard, followed by the terrible, groaning sound of tearing wet wood. I didn't wait for permission or explain my actions. I turned on my heel and ran through the kitchen, throwing open the heavy glass back doors. The wind hit me like a physical punch to the chest, driving freezing rain directly into my face. Down at the private dock, the water was boiling. The windward was pitching violently, rising 4 feet in the swell and crashing down. The forward spring line had snapped under the sheer tension, and the massive, sharp bow was swinging out, threatening to crush the pristine fiberglass hull against the barnacle-covered wooden pilings. I sprinted down the slippery, algae-slicked wooden stairs, my boots fighting for traction. I heard Valerie yelling my name over the howling wind, but I tuned it out completely. My focus narrowed strictly to the geometry and physics of the problem in front of me. A 50-foot boat displaces a massive amount of water. You don't stop that kind of kinetic energy with muscle. You stop it with leverage and friction. I hit the floating dock, sliding on my knees. I grabbed the heavy, thick braided nylon of the remaining bowline. It was bar-tight, vibrating and groaning under the immense strain. I wrapped the slack end around the base of the primary reinforced dock piling, creating a heavy friction brake to slow the momentum. "Connor!" Valerie reached the dock, her gray pullover soaked straight through from the freezing rain. She reached blindly for the tensioned line. "Stay back!" I barked, my voice cutting cleanly through the gale. "If this snaps under load, the recoil will take your arm off." I waited, watching the rhythm of the waves. I needed the boat to pitch downward into a trough to create a half-second of slack in the line. The moment it dipped, I hauled the thick nylon in 2 feet, wrapping it in a rapid, precise figure-8 motion over the heavy steel cleat bolted to the deck, locking it down hard with a half-hitch. The boat slammed heavily against the rubber fenders, compressing them, but the bow was secure. The immediate, catastrophic danger was neutralized. I stood up slowly, wiping the blinding salt water and rain from my eyes. Valerie was standing exactly where I had told her to stop, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the freezing wind. She was staring at the cleat, tracking the secure knots, then looked up at me. "It's secured," I said, my voice returning to a normal, even volume, completely devoid of adrenaline. "But those lines are old and degraded from UV exposure. We need to double them up for the night or she'll break loose again before dawn." "I'll get the spare storm lines from the aft lazarette," she said instantly, stepping toward the violently pitching deck of the boat. I moved laterally, stepping directly in front of her and blocking her path with my body. "The deck is covered in slick rain, the boat is bucking, and you're wearing thin indoor shoes. Go back inside the house, Valerie. I'll rig the storm lines. I know exactly where the gear is stowed." She bristled, her jaw tightening as she looked up at me. "It's my boat. I don't need to be sent to my room. It's not about authority. It's about efficiency and keeping you uninjured," I said bluntly, not moving an inch. "You getting hurt out here in the dark doesn't get the boat to the city marina by Monday. Go inside. Make coffee. Check the National Weather Service radar on the laptop." For a second, I thought she would argue. Her pride was a tangible, heavy thing in the air between us, a defensive wall built from years of being undermined. But she looked at my steady, unyielding posture, processed the cold logic of my statement, and gave a sharp, definitive nod. She turned and walked carefully back up the stairs to the house. I spent the next 40 grueling minutes in the freezing rain, rigging redundant spring lines, adjusting the heavy pneumatic fenders, and securing the loose halyards that were slapping loudly against the aluminum mast. By the time I finished, my hands were numb and my shoulders burned with deep fatigue. When I finally walked back into the kitchen, shedding a puddle of water on the tile, the house was incredibly warm. Valerie had a steaming mug of dark, black coffee waiting on the granite island. She had changed into dry, functional jeans and a heavy, oversized wool sweater. "Drink," she said, pushing the ceramic mug toward me. I took it, the intense heat transferring instantly into my frozen palms. "The rigging is locked down tight. We're perfectly safe until morning." "Richard called," she said quietly, staring intently at the marble pattern on the countertop. 10 minutes ago. He asked if the boat had sunk yet. He's enjoying this. He likes the panic. Let him enjoy tonight," I said, taking a sip of the bitter, scalding coffee. I didn't offer to call Richard. I didn't offer empty comforts. Tomorrow, we take the boat and we end his game. At 0400 hours, the house was silent except for the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof. I was already down at the dock, dressed in my professional foul weather gear, heavy yellow bibs, and a reinforced waterproof jacket. The heavy fiberglass engine hatch of the Windward was propped open. I had a small, powerful flashlight clenched tightly in my teeth, checking the oil viscosity, clearing the raw water strainer of seaweed, and testing the tension on the alternator belt with my thumb. The massive diesel engine hummed to life on the very first crank, sending a steady, reassuring vibration through the hull and into my boots. I climbed up the steep companionway steps to the cockpit. Valerie was already there, stowing a yellow waterproof ditch bag in the lazarette. She was moving fast, her movements sharp, rigid, and deeply anxious. "I checked the radar," she said, not looking at me. Her hands hovered over the brass latch, then stopped like the gale wasn't the only thing she was bracing against. "The Coast Guard just issued a small craft advisory for the entire northern sound. Wind gusts are predicted up to 45 knots. Maybe we should wait until noon and see if it breaks. If we wait until noon, we miss the outgoing tide entirely, and we don't make the transit by nightfall," I said, stepping up to the helm and checking the glowing red numbers on the GPS display. "We leave now." She turned to face me, her posture incredibly rigid. "It's dangerous, Connor. If something breaks out there, if we have to call for a tow, Richard wins. He takes everything I have left." I didn't offer a motivational speech. I didn't tell her to calm down or patronize her. I reached out and tapped the heavy stainless steel wheel of the binnacle. "Look at me, Valerie." She stopped moving and met my eyes. "I have logged enough miles on the open ocean to know what a hull can take," I said, my voice calm, flat, and completely devoid of doubt. "I do not take risks with expensive vessels, and I absolutely do not take risks with the people standing on my deck. If you choose to make this run, I'm the captain on deck. If you don't, we stay tied up and call his lawyer. It's your boat, your call. But if we cast off, you follow my line. Are we clear?" She stared at me. The sheer, unapologetic clarity of the choice seemed to short-circuit her spiraling panic. She wasn't being ordered. She was being asked to commit. The tension in her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch as she read the absolute certainty in my posture. "Clear," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "Good." I glanced down at her hands. She was trying to hide it by clenching her fists, but her fingers were trembling from the bitter cold and from the adrenaline. I unzipped the deep, waterproof pocket of my jacket, pulled out a pair of thick, fleece-lined offshore sailing gloves, and held them out to her. I didn't say a word. I just kept my hand extended, offering the practical comfort without making a spectacle of her nerves. Valerie looked at the heavy gloves, then up at my face. She took them slowly, sliding the thick material onto her hands, flexing her fingers. "Thank you. Cast off the bowline," I said, shifting the heavy brass throttle of the diesel engine into reverse. We slipped out of the protected cove just as the gray, sickly light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy, oppressive cloud cover. The strict, necessary routine of the boat took over. I stood at the helm, my eyes constantly scanning the jagged horizon, reading the subtle, dark shifts in the water's surface that indicated incoming wind gusts. Valerie proved her competence within the first hour. When I called for a trim on the mainsail, she didn't hesitate. She handled the heavy Lumar winches with practiced, fluid efficiency, tailing the thick line smoothly and locking it into the self-tailing jaws with a sharp snap. For 3 solid hours, it was a quiet, functioning partnership. The domestic anchors of a boat in motion established themselves, creating a strange, isolated sanctuary. The rhythmic, violent crash of the sharp bow punching through the gray waves, the rich smell of diesel exhaust and damp canvas, the precise, economical movements we both made to avoid crossing each other's paths in the narrow, tilted cockpit. Around 0900 hours, I set the mechanical autopilot to hold our heading and ducked down the steep companionway to the navigation station to manually check our progress against the paper charts. I don't rely solely on digital screens. Valerie was in the small, cramped galley, bracing her hip expertly against the severe tilt of the hull as she poured hot, thick soup from a steel thermos into 2 heavy ceramic mugs. She turned and handed me a mug, being exceptionally careful not to spill a drop on the expensive electronics panel. Lucy texted before we lost cell signal. She woke up. She said to tell you she owes you a case of beer for last night. "Tell her I expect premium imports," I said, taking a slow sip. The heat felt incredible in my chest. Valerie offered a small, genuine smile. It changed her entire face, softening the harsh, guarded lines of stress around her mouth. "She trusts you." "Lucy doesn't trust many people. She gets that from me." She paused, looking out the reinforced glass porthole at the gray, churning water rushing past the hull. "Neither do I, if I'm being perfectly honest. Trust is a massive liability if the person hasn't earned it through action," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the GPS plotter, my voice perfectly level. "You shouldn't hand it out for free to anyone." "No," she agreed quietly, tracing the rim of her mug. "I learned that the hard way, Richard. He didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to make sure I couldn't function or survive without his money. This boat was the one thing my father left me. Richard fought for half the equity purely out of spite, to force me to sell it to pay him out." I set my mug down in the gimbaled cup holder, securing it. I didn't offer a platitude. I offered a fact. "He's not taking it today." Before she could reply, the VHF radio mounted directly above the chart table crackled to life, emitting the sharp, piercing, 3-tone blast of a priority alert. "Securite, Securite, Securite, all vessels in the Long Island Sound. This is Coast Guard Sector New Haven. Be advised, the National Weather Service has upgraded the incoming system to a severe gale warning. The Milton Point drawbridge will cease operations and lock down in the closed position at 1,400 hours today due to sustained high winds." I stared intensely at the black radio box. The Milton Point Bridge was our only access point into the protected city marina. It was scheduled to remain open until 2,000 hours. The deadline had just been moved up by 6 hours. If we didn't clear that massive steel structure by 2 o'clock, we were completely locked out of the harbor. We would default on the delivery, the legal deadline would pass, and Richard would win the asset. "Connor," Valerie said, her voice suddenly tight and breathless, "we're 4 hours away at our current speed. It's 1,000 hours right now? That gives us 0 margin. We need to drastically increase speed, I said, doing the time distance math instantly in my head. The engine alone won't push us past 7 knots against this massive current. We need to raise the forward Genoa sail and motor sail at maximum RPM. In a gale? She asked, her eyes going wide with legitimate fear. That's way too much canvas for this wind. If a gust hits us sideways, we'll broach and knock down. I'll deeply reef the main, but we absolutely need the raw pulling power of the headsail to punch through the tide in the narrows, I said, already moving rapidly up the companionway steps. It's a calculated, mathematical risk, but it's the only physical way we make that bridge before lockdown. The next 3 hours were a brutal, physical test of endurance. The weather deteriorated much faster than the forecast predicted. The sky turned a bruised, angry, almost black-purple, and the wind began to scream a high-pitched whine through the aluminum rigging. The windward heeled violently to starboard, the lee rail completely burying itself in the foaming, freezing gray water. I stood at the helm, my legs braced wide apart, my muscles screaming as I fought the heavy weather helm. Every tendon in my shoulders ached from the physical strain of wrestling the rudder, keeping the heavy bow from spinning uncontrollably up into the wind. Valerie was huddled in the cockpit, firmly tethered to the yellow jackline, her eyes fixed fearfully on the strained sails. At 1,315 hours, we were exactly 5 miles from the bridge. The massive steel structure was visible in the distance, a dark, looming line across the gray, violent horizon. We were going to make it. Then, a sudden, violent gust hit us a microburst, dropping straight down from the heavy storm clouds like a hammer. The boat slammed over onto its side at a terrifying 45-degree angle. Below deck, I heard the catastrophic crash of dishes shattering out of their cabinets. The wind caught the massive Genoa sail perfectly, snapping the heavy, 1-inch thick sheet line with a sound exactly like a shotgun firing. The huge, heavy sail instantly began flogging violently in the gale, cracking like a massive whip. The force was immense, violently shaking the entire boat. If the sail wasn't neutralized immediately, the chaotic energy would tear the aluminum mast right out of the fiberglass deck. The sheet snapped, Valerie yelled, sheer panic finally breaking completely through her composure. She scrambled backward. "Take the helm!" I roared over the deafening wind. She froze, clinging desperately to the stainless binnacle, her eyes wide with terror. "I can't hold it in this wind. It's too heavy." "Take the wheel, Valerie," I ordered, stepping away from the helm and locking my eyes dead onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "Keep the bow pointed exactly at the center of that bridge. Do not let it turn an inch. You can do this. I trust you." She grabbed the leather-wrapped wheel, her knuckles turning bone-white, her jaw setting into a hard line. I watched her fight the immense hydraulic pressure of the rudder, her boots slipping slightly on the wet teak deck, until she locked her knees and found her center of balance. The bow steadied. She held the course. I clipped my heavy safety tether to the jackline and crawled forward on my hands and knees along the violently pitching, slick deck. The freezing rain felt like gravel hitting my face, nearly blinding me. The Genoa was thrashing wildly above me, the heavy steel clew block swinging back and forth like a lethal wrecking ball. I timed the violent rhythm of the boat. As the bow dipped heavily into a deep wave, I lunged forward, grabbing the thick, flailing sailcloth and throwing my entire body weight over it to pin it flat to the deck. Working completely blind in the saltwater spray, my hands freezing, I pulled a spare length of high-tensile line from my belt. I threaded it rapidly through the steel clew ring and tied a flawless, rapid bowline knot. I dragged the line back to the midships winch, wrapped it 3 times around the drum, and hauled the sail tight again, locking it down and restoring forward power and stability to the vessel. The boat instantly flattened out, accelerating back up to hull speed. I crawled back to the safety of the cockpit, my chest heaving, icy water pouring in sheets off my yellow gear. Valerie was still standing at the helm, her eyes locked dead ahead on the bridge, steering perfectly through the chop. I stepped up closely beside her, placing my large hand gently over her smaller, trembling ones on the top of the wheel to take back physical control. "I've got it," I said softly, the tension bleeding out of my voice. She let go, her arms dropping heavily to her sides. She looked at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She had held the boat in a crisis. She hadn't broken. "You did good," I said, keeping my eyes fixed forward on the channel. I didn't hug her. I didn't offer a flowery compliment. I gave her the absolute, undeniable fact of her own Competence. At 1,348 hours, 12 minutes before the absolute deadline, we cleared the Milton Point drawbridge. A few minutes later, the massive steel spans locked down securely, with a heavy thud behind us. We were finally inside the protected, flat harbor of the city marina. The wind was still howling above us, but the water was blissfully calm. I guided the windward slowly down the long, concrete channel towards Slip 44. As we approached the designated pier, I saw a figure standing rigidly in the rain, flanked by a man wearing a bright yellow municipal harbor master jacket. "That's Richard," Valerie said, her voice dropping instantly to a cold, dead monotone. He was wearing a tailored, expensive, waterproof trench coat, looking entirely out of place and ridiculous on a working commercial dock. As I shifted the engine into neutral, using a quick burst of reverse thrust and the natural prop walk to glide the heavy boat flawlessly into the narrow slip despite the crosswind, Richard stepped forward to the very edge of the concrete, a profoundly smug expression on his face. I threw the thick bow and stern lines to the waiting dock hands. Before I even reached down to shut off the engine, Richard was talking loudly. "You're late, Valerie," he called out over the idling rumble of the diesel. The legal deadline was for the vessel to be fully secured and logged by the harbor master. "You cut it too close. I'm claiming default on the settlement." Valerie stepped confidently onto the deck. She stepped onto the concrete, her spine perfectly straight, eyes locked dead on the man who had tried to corner her. "We are physically in the slip, Richard," she said clearly, her voice carrying over the wind. "The harbor master's office officially closed at 1,330 hours due to the severe weather protocol." Richard countered smoothly, gesturing to the man beside him. "Jim here is off duty. He can't officially log your arrival in the municipal system until tomorrow morning, which means, legally speaking, you didn't meet the Monday 0800 hours deadline of a documented, logged arrival. You forfeit the asset." Valerie went perfectly still. The manipulation was so incredibly clean, so bureaucratic. Richard had used the storm closure to create an unavoidable legal trap. I stepped up beside Valerie on the deck. I didn't yell. I didn't puff out my chest or try to physically intimidate him. I looked at Richard with utter dismissal, then turned my attention directly to the municipal harbor master. "Are you Jim Thompson?" I asked. The harbor master blinked, slightly surprised by my calm tone. "Yeah. But like he said, the office is closed. I am Captain Connor Young, United States Coast Guard license number 884 Delta," I said, my voice projecting clearly and with absolute authority in the rain. I reached deep into my waterproof interior jacket pocket and pulled out a bound, heavy, leather-covered logbook. My captain's log is a sworn federal record. Counsel can verify it, but it's more than enough to defeat a cheap technicality when the port is under an emergency weather hold. I opened the book, pulled a waterproof black pen from my pocket, and wrote the exact GPS coordinates, the exact time down to the minute, and the slip number. I signed it with a sharp stroke, closed the heavy book with a loud snap, and handed it directly to Valerie. "The arrival is officially logged at 1,355 hours, I said, looking right through Richard. "Your paperwork is documented and secure." Valerie took the heavy logbook, her fingers brushing mine. She looked down at the sworn record, then slowly looked up at Richard. The smugness had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a tight, incredibly ugly, angry red flush. His trap had just been dismantled with a single pen stroke. "If your lawyer wants to try and challenge a federal master's sworn log in court," Valerie said, her voice ringing with a newfound, absolute authority as she wielded the proof, "tell him to file a motion. But this boat is mine, and you are trespassing on my rented dock. Leave." Richard opened his mouth to argue, looked at the logbook, then looked at my steady, unblinking, heavily built stance, and wisely chose silence. He turned sharply on his heel and walked rapidly away down the pier, his expensive coat flapping in the wind. The silence that followed was heavy and triumphant, filled only by the sound of the rain hitting the fiberglass deck. We spent the next 40 minutes meticulously securing the boat, doubling up the dock lines, hooking up the heavy yellow shore power cable, and locking the hatches. Down below, the teak cabin was incredibly warm. The diesel heater was running flawlessly. I took off my dripping wet jacket and tossed it over the nav station chair, rolling my shoulders to relieve the deep ache in my muscles. I pulled my phone from my pocket and deliberately placed it face down on the table, pushing it away. The outside world and my own fatigue could wait. I gave Valerie my full, undivided attention. She was sitting on the plush settee, holding the logbook in her lap. She looked exhausted, her hair damp and messy, but the heavy, suffocating weight that had surrounded her since I walked into her house was entirely gone. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, looking up at me. "Putting your own commercial license log on the line against his lawyers?" "I record facts," I said simply, sitting across from her at the heavy teak table. "The fact is, we arrived on time, through a gale. You earned this. I just removed his artificial leverage." She looked at me, really looked at me, her dark eyes searching my face. "You didn't try to take over when the bridge closed and the sail blew out. You didn't push me aside. You gave me the wheel. You were the best, most capable person for the job at that exact moment," I replied, meaning every word. "I've spent 4 incredibly long years fighting Richard, constantly trying to prove I didn't need anyone," she murmured, tracing the gold-embossed lettering on the logbook cover with her thumb. "I thought asking for help meant I was weak and vulnerable. Asking the wrong person for help is a weakness," I corrected her, keeping my voice low, steady, and entirely honest. I wanted to reach out and touch her hand, to offer physical comfort, but I kept my hands firmly planted on the table. Asking the right person to stand with you is just good logistics. My phone buzzed against the teak wood. I flipped it over. A text illuminated the screen from Lucy. "Mom finally won one. Thanks, Cap." I slid the phone back, offering Valerie a small nod. She smiled, a quiet expression of profound relief and understanding. Good logistics. The next morning, the storm had entirely broken. The sky was a brilliant, harsh, cloudless blue. We walked up the wooden dock together toward the main marina office to finalize the permanent slip paperwork. The dock was busy with other owners loudly checking their boats for storm damage and shouting over the noise of the harbor. As we reached the glass office door, Valerie stopped abruptly. She opened her leather purse and pulled out a heavy brass key attached to a bright yellow floating cork lanyard. She held it out to me, the brass catching the morning sun. "What's this?" I asked, looking at the key but not taking it. "It's the spare companionway key," she said, her voice clear, steady, and carrying enough for the nearby dockhands and the harbor master to easily hear. "I need a permanent captain for the Windward. Someone who absolutely doesn't panic. Someone who tells me the hard truth, even when it's uncomfortable." She held my gaze, making the public choice without a single hesitation or ounce of fear. "I want it to be you. On your terms." I looked at the brass key, then up at her face. The defensive walls were gone. I didn't need to think about the complications or the logistics. I reached out and took the key from her hand, my fingers briefly brushing hers. "Schedule full engine maintenance for Tuesday," I said, sliding the key safely into my pocket. "And you're not buying cheap coffee for my galley anymore." Her smile broke wide, bright, and completely unguarded. "Aye, Captain." Closing thoughts. I learned that true strength isn't about stubbornly fighting every single battle completely alone. It's about trusting the right person to stand beside you when the storm hits. Real partnership is built on competence, immense respect, and doing the hard work without ever keeping score. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this. The end.